Hey guys, welcome back. This is the William Optics Uniguide 50-200mm guide scope. It's a 50mm aperture, 200mm focal length guide scope, and it's got this little Vixen base formed into the body itself, so it makes it fairly easy to attach it particularly to a William Optics scope where the handle is formed to receive a Vixen-style dovetail bar. I want to do some experimenting eventually with this new multi-star guiding algorithm that's in PHD2 and compare that to the single-star guiding results I'm getting with the off-axis guider. This is going to be part one. We'll focus on laying out what the guide scope looks like, how it operates, achieving focus with the camera, and then we'll wait for a later date when I go back to the GT81 in this case to actually perform the experiment. The common advice is to use long exposures, say the 2 to 4 second range. That means send guiding commands to the mount at 2 to 4 second intervals in order to average out the random star motion due to seeing. Okay, that's reasonably good advice, but the PHD2 algorithm works best with short exposures for controlling mount gear pointing errors. So if you've got a mount like my C-Gem where ball bearings, gear, tooth interactions, and various other mechanical disturbances are creating pointing errors that you need to correct with PHD2, those pointing errors can happen at a fairly quick pace, and you need, in order to keep up with the errors, you need to be issuing commands to the mount at a very rapid pace. But the problem, of course, with that is that short exposure times lead to this chasing the seeing problem. And that's where this new multi-star PHD2 guiding algorithm may be really strong. It should dramatically reduce the seeing effects because it's tracking what multiple stars are doing in the field, and theoretically the different stars are, at least when affected by seeing, are moving in random directions relative to each other. So the algorithm will look at multiple stars and average out the motion so that you get the net effect is just what the mount is doing and not what the sky is doing. That means we should be able to use short exposures to achieve better results and let the multi-star guiding algorithm eliminate the seeing. I just need a wider field of view than what I'm getting from my off-axis guider in order to see multiple stars. Let's go off and take a look at some of the features of the guide scope. So here I have the new William Optics Uniguide 50-200mm guide scope sitting next to my William Optics GT81, and you can see this scale here. These guide scopes are kind of handy. They're very lightweight, and they come in with an attached Vixen-style mounting bar, which allows it to very easily interface with the handlebar of the GT81 and other telescopes that are being produced by William Optics. So it's very handy, and it takes away all the concerns about having guide rings and all the problems that creates. So this is a very nice interface. It's a very lightweight scope, and the package contents are very limited. This is what you get. You get the camera, you get a rubber nose piece here. There's no batten-off mask. It's a guide scope, so you don't get the standard batten-off mask that you would get in one of their telescopes. And you get this 36mm long spacer element here. We'll come back to that in a second. Now, one of the things that is nice also about this guide scope is that the lens elements, they're attached to the dew shield, and they are fairly far recessed back in here so that given the small size of the lens, given the depth of recess that we have, it's highly unlikely that you're going to need to have a dew strap on your guide scope as I do with the telescopes that I use. So I'm going to try getting away without using a dew strap on this. In terms of inserting a camera, both the William Optics website and reseller websites such as Agena Astro, which is where I bought this from, mention how the telescope has very limited back focus and that it's particularly well suited for the cylindrical style, the new style of guide cameras being produced by ZWO and others. And so it makes you wonder whether or not you can actually achieve focus with an old style camera, which is what I intend to do with my original ASI 120 USB 2 camera. We'll come back to that in a minute. So that's one of the concerns. According to the William Optics website, there's about 175 millimeters back from the lens elements here back to the back face of this rotolock element here, which leaves you with another roughly 25 millimeters that you got to cover with back focus. Some of that can come from rotating the dew shield out, which also rotates or brings out the lens elements. And I've rotated this back out. You would rotate it out, then lock this ring rotates, is threaded on the same threads. You would lock it in place by rotating this ring. And I've measured at least, and there's at least 10 millimeters of distance that you can get from this if you need that amount of extension. For what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this fully retracted against the barrel of the scope, and I'm going to do all the focusing by loosening the rotor lock and sliding in or out the camera in order to move the imaging plane, and then tighten up the rotor lock to lock it in place. If you're using one of these newer style cameras, I suggest you install this 36 millimeter extension. You would take this element off. It screws off as a unit. You would apply this guy on, and then you would take this and screw it onto the end of that. And then that would take you back another 36 millimeters. You only need 25. So what that means is when you insert the cylindrical style guide camera in, the sensor will be about 10 or so millimeters into this rotor lock feature, which gives you plenty of room and plenty of barrel length to grip onto it with the rotor lock. So if you're using this style of guide camera, you probably want to install this guy. For me, I'm going to use this style of guide camera and not install that. Now, this guide camera, the imaging sensor is about 12.5 millimeters back from the forward end here. I've got the nose piece on, and it's got a little shoulder that's about 1.5 millimeters. So that covers about half the distance I need. And then I need another 10 to 11 or so millimeters to get me back to the proper position for focusing. And I should have plenty of length along this nose piece here to slide this in and out to achieve that focus. The alternative is you can get some spacers, and I happen to have a couple of spacers. For example, this guy here is a 6 millimeter long spacer that came with the Celestron off-axis guider. I just don't happen to be using it in the guiders in that OAG setup. So that's an option that can get me 6 millimeters. And for other reasons, I had bought this, I believe it's a blue Fireball 5 millimeter spacer, and so I could use that too in order to reduce the amount of exposed length on this barrel, but there's plenty of good structure here to grab onto, so that may not be a problem at all. I'm going to go ahead and give that a shot. The problem I've had, and I noticed this a little over a year ago, when this camera was originally designed and released by ZWO, the USB standard that they used did not match up with the standard of the USB 2 that was being accepted by everybody else. And now that USB ports have evolved, we have USB 3, and they are backward compatible with the true standard of the USB 2. This is not. And I've had problems with this particular camera. For example, it will not operate in the mono 16 mode. It will operate in mono 8 for a little while, and then it'll just start dropping frames and essentially not provide any more output of frames. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is go over into the ZWO website, download the firmware update tool, and try to upgrade the firmware inside the camera with the hopes that I'll still be able to use this camera. Other than that, it's just a paperweight. Let's go over to the ZWO website and see if we can update this camera. All right, well, it's time to take the dive. Before I can do a focusing test with the monochrome 120mm, I've got to do a firmware upgrade. I've got to flash the hardware. So this is a conversation I had back in August of 2019 when I first encountered this problem. I just haven't gotten around to doing it because I had a workaround, bought the ASI 290 and used that as a guide camera. But now I want to go ahead and, given that the ASI 120 is basically useless, unless I do something about upgrading the firmware for the current USB driver format, it might as well be a paperweight. So here's the response I got back from Catherine at ZWO. She tells me that it's an old camera. It is. It's probably the first camera I bought from them. It might have been their first camera for all I know. And she points me to a firmware upgrade tool, a .zip file on their website. And if you go over to their website, you can scroll down to the support page and then from the support page go to the firmware update, and then you'll find a couple of entries on this page for USB camera and the apparently the electronic automatic focuser as well. What I'm going to be doing, since I have a Windows system, I've downloaded this file here, and so let's go over to the directory where I've unzipped the file, and this is what you end up with. You have a README text. We'll take a look at that in a second. You have the actual software that does the firmware update, and then inside this directory here is the USB 2, USB 3 version. I have the USB 2 version, and within here I've got the ASI 120. So this is probably the file that I'm going to select as opposed to one of these compatible files. So it's the ASI 120mm.iic file that we will come back to. The camera is plugged in currently, and so presumably all I've got to do, go ahead and execute this. As I said, the camera is plugged in, so let's see what happens. It connected device is the ASI 120mm. That's true. We want a firmware version via USB 2, and we'll press that button. And that'll be this guy here, the ASI 120mm, not the compatible version of the file, but just the mm.iic. Alright, it says it was successful. Nothing blew up. I don't smell any smoke, so maybe that's a good thing. Let's go ahead and turn that off. And I'm going to unplug the camera. And now I'm going to reboot the camera. Alright, so it's plugged in. So let's see if it behaves well under SharpCap now. It is plugged in. It sees the camera. And we're in mono 8. I'm looking for dropped frames down here. Right now there are no dropped frames. I'm getting about 15 or 13 frames per second, which is pretty good. Problem that I was seeing before was it would operate in mono 8, but then after a certain number of frames were collected, it would start dropping them all. I'm going to step this back up to about 10 or so. Okay, so I'm operating at the maximum frame rate it can put out with the mono 8 configuration, and I'm not getting too many dropped frames. It seems to be working a little better than it was before I did the refresh the RAM. Of course, now the frames are dropping a little faster. It turns out that after doing the firmware reflash for the ASI 120 and then trying to hook it up to PHD2, I was still dropping frames to the point where it's basically useless as a guide camera because the camera will disconnect from PHD2 because of the dropped frames. I've gone back now to my ASI 120MC, the color camera, but it's also the USB 3 camera. So I can select the ASI 120MCS, and we can see the barest hint of the nearly in focus image. There's a chimney about 940 feet distant, which is about as far as I can see from the house here. I'm going to try to zoom in on that and do some focusing. Get to find the target. There it is. As you can see, we're darn near in focus, and that's pretty good right there. Okay, so that's a fairly in focus image. So the focus test was pretty successful. It's very easy to focus by moving the camera in and out a little bit, making small adjustments to achieve pretty good focus. I was focusing on this chimney back in the distance here, about 940 feet away, and the focus is pretty crisp, even though I didn't have to try too hard to achieve it. So that worked fairly well. At the end, when I took the camera out and measured the distance, it's about 10 millimeters from the back face of the rotolock feature to the forward face, the red part of the camera. And if you add that to the 12.5, that's about 22.5. So it's a little shorter than I would have expected had I put spacers in. But that gives you an idea. There's plenty of meat on the nose piece here to grab onto with the rotolock, so there's no concern there. Didn't have any issue at all focusing with this style camera. So if you're interested in getting one of these guide scopes, just leave out the extension, the 36mm extension tube they give you, and focus like this, and you're good to go. The whole idea is that I want to experiment with the new Multi-Star PHD2 guiding algorithm, but I need a larger field of view. I think that will serve it better, at least, certainly for my refractors, 700 millimeter and 385 millimeter. Don't know if this is all that well suited for a long focal length system like my SCT, but it's worth a shot with the other refractors just to see how the algorithm works. It's a relatively inexpensive scope. It interfaces quite easily, certainly with the William Optics scopes, because of the Vixen style handle that comes with those telescopes, so it just slides right in, no issue there. I did try reflashing the firmware on my original ASI 120mm. That's the old style design, just like my MC, my 120MC. The firmware update tool ran. It said it was successful, but at the end of the day, when I plugged the camera into PHD2, it didn't download images and would stall out, causing the camera to be disconnected. So I guess I'll have to use the ASI 120 at least initially for these experiments. The camera works fine. Ideally, you don't want to use a color camera as a guide camera because it's just not as sensitive. But hey, got an awesome paperweight out of the deal, so that's something. If you look on the William Optics website and the reseller websites, you'll find that there's an emphasis in using this Guidescope with the cylinder type guide cameras that are out now. And I was certainly, that caused some initial concern before I bought it, but looking at the dimensions, looking at the focal length, looking at the cameras that I had, it seemed like it should work, and it turned out that it worked very easy. It was very easy to focus with the old style ASI 120 design with the screw-on nose piece. No issue focusing whatsoever. So if you're interested in one of these guide scopes and have one of these older cameras that works, feel free to jump in. Water's fine. I will try refining the focus once I get out under the stars. I'll find a bright star. And I've got this little batten-off mask that I bought for my 50mm lenses that I have with the DSLR. I never actually used it with the DSLR, but it fits perfectly. It's the same diameter as the dew shield, so with just holding it on with a piece of tape, it'll work. I'm sure it'll work just fine. We'll do part 2, which is the multi-star guiding portion of this 2-part series once nebula season returns and I get one of the refractors back on the mount. So stay tuned, and we'll talk to you guys later. Clear skies.